For 15 years, I believed my husband cared more about his wealth than about me. He built an empire, collected properties, hid documents, traveled alone, and locked himself behind an office door I was never allowed to open. When he died, I expected nothing. But then the lawyer handed me a thick envelope, his will. My name was written on every page. He had left me $48 million, the entire fortune he once guarded like a dragon protecting gold. But the inheritance wasn't the real twist. 3 days after the funeral, a second letter arrived, sealed in red wax, addressed only with, "For when you're ready to know the truth." Inside it, he confessed everything he had hidden, the betrayals, the deals, the enemies, the fear that his past would destroy me. And then came the secret he never said aloud. He never planned to leave me alone. Because in his final note, he confessed the unimaginable, that he had staged parts of his life, manipulated others, and orchestrated the inheritance so I would discover something far bigger than money, a truth that would change not just my life, but everything I believed about him, and about myself. And when I finally uncovered what he left buried beneath the fortune, nothing would ever be the same. If you want to know what my husband buried beneath $48 million, and how his final confession changed everything I thought I knew, hit that like button and subscribe now. Comment below about a secret that changed your life. This story will shake you to your core. Let's begin. My name is Eleanor, and for 15 years I lived in the shadow of a man whose fortune seemed more real to him than I ever was. My husband Richard built an empire in commercial real estate and private equity, accumulating wealth that most people couldn't comprehend, while I lived in a beautiful prison of isolation and emotional neglect. When he died at 58 from a sudden heart attack, I grieved the man I'd once loved while feeling relief that the lonely marriage was finally over. Then came the will reading, and then came the letter, and then came the discovery that rewrote everything I thought I understood about my husband, my marriage, and my own identity. I met Richard when I was 27 and he was 32. I was working as an art curator at a small gallery, passionate about my work but making barely enough to cover rent in my tiny apartment. Richard came to an exhibition opening, immediately commanded the room with his presence and confidence, and pursued me with an intensity I found flattering and overwhelming. He was already successful, already wealthy from family money he'd multiplied through smart investments. Within 6 months he'd convinced me to marry him, promising a life of security and partnership. The early years weren't terrible. Richard worked constantly, but when he was present, he could be attentive and generous. He bought us a stunning home in an exclusive neighborhood, encouraged me to continue my work at the gallery, took me on luxurious vacations to Europe and Asia. But slowly, imperceptibly, the walls started closing in. Richard became more obsessed with growing his wealth, spending longer hours working, traveling frequently for business deals. His home office became forbidden territory, always locked, containing filing cabinets and safes I was never allowed near. He grew increasingly controlling about finances despite our wealth. I had an allowance for household expenses and personal spending, but no access to the actual accounts or investment portfolios. When I asked about our financial situation, Richard would dismiss me, saying I didn't need to worry about such things, that he was handling everything. I felt more like an employee or decoration than a wife and partner. My work at the gallery became my refuge, the one part of my life I could control. By our 10th anniversary, we were essentially strangers living in the same house. Richard spent most nights in his office working or traveling for business. We rarely ate meals together. Our physical intimacy had dwindled to nothing. When I tried to discuss the state of our marriage, Richard would promise to make more time but never actually change anything. I felt invisible, a ghost in a mansion, married to a man who seemed to care only about accumulating more wealth and power. I thought about divorce constantly, but never acted on it, partly because I'd grown comfortable with the lifestyle despite the emotional emptiness, partly because Richard had made it clear through his lawyers that any divorce would be contested and expensive, that he'd fight to protect his assets, partly because I'd invested 15 years into this marriage and felt foolish about walking away with nothing. So I stayed, growing more resentful and lonely with each passing year, watching my husband transform into someone unrecognizable from the man I'd married. Then Richard died. It was sudden and shocking, a massive heart attack while he was working late in his office. I found him slumped over his desk at 2 in the morning when I'd gone down to ask him to come to bed. The paramedics said he'd been dead for hours. He was 58 years old, seemingly healthy despite the stress he constantly carried. The funeral was elaborate, attended by hundreds of business associates and acquaintances, but few actual friends. I stood beside the casket feeling numb, grieving more for the marriage I'd never had than for the man I'd lost. 1 week after the funeral, I sat in Richard's lawyer's office for the will reading. I expected minimal inheritance, maybe the house and a modest amount to live on. Richard had always been paranoid about gold diggers and had made me sign an extensive prenuptial agreement before our wedding. His business partner Daniel was there, along with Richard's younger brother Marcus and the lawyer Samuel Rothstein, who'd handled Richard's legal affairs for decades. Samuel opened a thick envelope and began reading Richard's will. My name appeared immediately and repeatedly. Richard had left me everything: the house, the investment properties, the stock portfolios, the business holdings, the offshore accounts. Every single asset he'd accumulated was now mine. Samuel provided a summary of the total value, approximately $48 million once everything was liquidated and calculated. I sat there in complete shock as the lawyer explained that I was now an extraordinarily wealthy woman. Daniel and Marcus were clearly surprised but not upset. Richard had made separate generous provisions for his brother and had bought out Daniel's partnership stake before his death, so neither man was left without means. But the entirety of his personal fortune had come to me, the wife he'd seemed to barely tolerate for the last decade of our marriage. Samuel handed me folders containing account information, property deeds, investment statements. It would take weeks to fully process the extent of what Richard had left me. I went home that night reeling from the revelation. Why had Richard left me everything? He'd kept me at arm's length for years, controlled and limited my access to money, treated me like an expensive employee rather than a beloved partner. None of this made sense. I sat in his office, finally allowed to enter now that he was gone, surrounded by filing cabinets and locked drawers I'd never been permitted to touch. I felt more confused than wealthy, more unsettled than grateful. 3 days after the will reading, a package arrived by special courier. It was addressed to me in Richard's handwriting, marked, "To be delivered 3 days after will reading," with instructions to the law firm. The envelope was thick, sealed with red wax, stamped with Richard's signet ring. Across the front in his precise handwriting, "For when you're ready to know the truth." My hands shook as I broke the seal and pulled out the contents. Inside was a letter, pages and pages in Richard's handwriting, and a small key attached to a note that said, "For the safe in my office, combination is your birthday." I sat down at Richard's desk, the desk where he'd died, and began reading his final confession. The letter started with an apology. Richard wrote that he'd been a terrible husband, that he'd isolated and controlled me, that he'd built walls between us that grew higher every year. He said he'd loved me more than I could possibly know, but that love had become twisted by fear and secrets he'd never found the courage to share while alive. He said the $48 million was both an apology and a tool, that the money would give me freedom to discover truths he'd hidden and to build a life beyond the prison our marriage had become. Then he started explaining the secrets. Richard's family wealth hadn't come from legitimate business as I'd always been told. His grandfather had been involved in organized crime in the 1940s and 50s, building a fortune through gambling, loan sharking, and protection rackets. Richard's father had laundered and legitimized some of that money through real estate investments but had maintained connections to criminal networks. Richard had inherited both the clean money and the dirty connections. When Richard and I married, he'd been trying to distance himself from his family's criminal past. But certain people from those old networks had come calling, demanding favors and investments and cooperation in exchange for keeping secrets buried. Richard had complied initially, using his legitimate business as cover for laundering money and facilitating deals for people he was afraid to refuse. Over the years, he'd gotten deeper into arrangements that compromised his integrity and put him at risk. Richard wrote that he'd kept me at distance deliberately to protect me from this reality. The less I knew, the safer I was from both the criminals he dealt with and potential legal consequences if his activities were ever exposed. He'd maintained that locked office and those secret files to contain a double life he never wanted touching me directly. His constant travel and late nights weren't just about legitimate business, but about managing relationships with dangerous people and covering tracks. But here's where the letter took an unexpected turn. Richard explained that for the last 5 years of his life, he'd been planning his exit from these entanglements and orchestrating a way to protect me while exposing the network he'd been trapped in. He'd been gathering evidence, documenting transactions, recording conversations. He'd been building a case that could bring down several major criminal operations while shielding his own involvement through carefully constructed legal protections. Richard had known he was dying sooner than the heart attack suggested. He'd been diagnosed with a serious heart condition 6 months before his death, given maybe a year to live with treatment. Instead of telling me or pursuing aggressive intervention, he'd accelerated his plans. He'd restructured all his assets to put them entirely in my name with ironclad legal protections. He'd compiled his evidence and arranged for it to be delivered to law enforcement through channels that couldn't be traced back to him or me. And he'd written this letter to explain everything, knowing I'd read it after he was gone and the wheels he'd set in motion were already turning. The key, he explained, opened a safe in his office containing documents I would need, not the evidence he'd gathered for law enforcement that was already being delivered through other means, but documents that would explain his legitimate businesses, how to manage the assets he'd left me, and most importantly, information about my own past that he'd discovered and hidden from me because he didn't know how to share it while he was alive. I sat with the letter for over an hour, reading and rereading, trying to process everything Richard had confessed. My husband had been involved in criminal activity while protecting me from that knowledge. He'd been planning his death and its aftermath meticulously. He'd left me a fortune as both apology and tool for whatever came next. And there were secrets about my own past that he'd uncovered and hidden. I used the key and my birthday as combination to open Richard's safe. Inside were dozens of files organized with characteristic precision, some related to his businesses and investments, instructions for managing properties and portfolios. Some contained his evidence of criminal networks, copies of what he'd already sent to authorities, and one thick folder had my name on it. I opened the folder and found documents related to my adoption. I'd always known I was adopted. My parents had been open about that. I'd been placed with them as an infant through a private adoption agency. I'd never felt any particular need to search for my biological parents, feeling complete with the family who'd raised me. But Richard had apparently done that search without telling me. According to the documents Richard had compiled, my biological mother had been a young woman named Catherine Sullivan, who'd gotten pregnant at 17. The father was never identified on any official records. Catherine had been from a wealthy family, and the pregnancy had been handled discreetly through private channels. She'd given birth, signed away her rights, and the adoption had been arranged through an agency that specialized in helping wealthy families avoid scandal. Catherine Sullivan had gone on to marry and have other children, building a life that looked nothing like the scared teenager who'd given up a baby. She was now Catherine Blackwell, wife of a prominent businessman, mother to 3 adult children, respected in Philadelphia high society. She didn't know what had become of the baby girl she'd placed for adoption 42 years ago. But here's what made Richard's investigation especially shocking. Catherine Blackwell's husband, the man she'd married 5 years after giving me up for adoption, was Robert Blackwell, Richard's business partner and close associate, the man I'd met dozens of times at dinners and events, one of the people who'd attended Richard's funeral. Robert Blackwell was married to my biological mother, making him my stepfather in ways none of us had known. Richard's letter explained how he'd discovered this connection. He'd been conducting routine background checks on a business deal with Robert when he'd noticed that Catherine had given birth to a daughter in the same month and year I was born. Further investigation had confirmed the adoption connection. Richard had been shocked, realizing that his wife and his business partner's wife were biological mother and daughter. He'd wrestled with whether to tell me, whether to tell Catherine and Robert, whether to disrupt all our lives with this information. Ultimately, he'd decided not to while he was alive, fearing it would create complications in his business relationship with Robert and not knowing how any of us would handle the revelation. But he'd documented everything so I could decide what to do with the information after he was gone. I sat in Richard's office, surrounded by the evidence of his secret life and secret knowledge, trying to process layers of revelation that kept multiplying. My husband had been involved in criminal activity. He'd been planning his death and posthumous exposure of criminal networks. He'd left me a fortune and the choice of what to do with knowledge about my biological family. Nothing about my life was what I'd thought it was. Over the following weeks, I worked with Samuel the lawyer to understand the full extent of Richard's estate and plans. The evidence Richard had compiled and sent to law enforcement had already started triggering investigations. Several of Richard's former associates were under scrutiny for money laundering and other financial crimes. Richard's own involvement had been structured legally to make him appear a victim of coercion rather than willing participant, protecting his legacy and my inheritance. The $48 million Richard left me was untouchable by any investigation or lawsuit because he'd transferred everything into my name years before his death through legitimate channels. Samuel had helped structure the transfers to pass all legal scrutiny. I was wealthy beyond my previous comprehension, finally free to live however I wanted, and burdened with knowledge I didn't know how to use. I thought for a long time about the information regarding Catherine Blackwell. Did I want to meet my biological mother? Did she deserve to know her firstborn daughter's identity? Would revealing this help or hurt both of us? What about Robert, who'd been Richard's friend and partner? How would this knowledge affect his marriage and family? After 3 months of consideration, I decided to reach out. I contacted Catherine through a carefully worded letter explaining that I was adopted, believed she might be my biological mother based on documentation I'd obtained, and would like to meet if she was interested in confirming the connection. I included my contact information and left the decision in her hands. Catherine responded within a week, her letter shaking with emotion I could feel through the handwriting. She said she'd thought about me every day for 42 years, wondered what had become of the baby girl she'd given up, hoped I'd had a good life. She said she'd always wanted to search for me but had been afraid of disrupting my life or facing rejection. She agreed to meet, suggested a neutral location, and signed the letter, "Your mother, if you'll let me be." We met at a small cafe in a town halfway between our cities. I recognized her immediately from photos I'd seen at Richard's business dinners, though now I noticed features I shared with her, the shape of our eyes and hands, the way we both tilted our heads when thinking. We sat across from each other, and I watched emotions play across her face as she studied me, looking for the infant she'd given away and the woman I'd become. We talked for 4 hours that first meeting. Catherine told me about the pregnancy, the fear and shame she'd felt, the pressure from her family to handle it discreetly, the pain of giving me away even though she'd believed it was best for both of us. She told me about her life afterward, how she'd met Robert Blackwell at 22 and married him within a year, how they'd had 3 children together, how she'd built a good life while carrying grief and guilt about the daughter she'd never known. I told her about my childhood with wonderful adoptive parents, about my marriage to Richard, about his recent death, and the inheritance and secrets he'd left behind. I explained the strange coincidence of my husband and her husband being business partners, about how Richard had discovered our connection but hadn't revealed it while alive. Catherine was stunned, realizing she'd met her biological daughter multiple times at events without knowing. We agreed to build a relationship slowly, to meet regularly, and get to know each other. Catherine wanted to tell Robert and her other children about me, and I agreed that honesty was better than continuing to hide the connection. When Robert learned the truth, he was shocked but ultimately supportive, understanding the bizarre coincidence that had brought us into each other's orbits unknowingly. I developed relationships with my 3 half-siblings, all within a few years of my age, who were curious and welcoming. I met extended family, saw photos of ancestors whose features I recognized in my own face. I felt a sense of belonging and identity I hadn't known I was missing. The family I'd gained through tragedy and revelation became one of the unexpected gifts of Richard's death and confession. But the biggest gift was the freedom Richard's inheritance provided. I was 42 years old, wealthy enough to never worry about money, and finally able to live authentically without the constraints of my marriage or previous financial limitations. I left the prison of the house Richard and I had shared, buying a smaller home in the city near my gallery. I expanded my work as a curator, funding exhibitions and supporting emerging artists. I traveled extensively, finally seeing the world on my own terms rather than as accessory to Richard's business trips. I thought often about Richard's final letter and his confession that the inheritance was both apology and tool. He'd given me wealth, knowing I'd use it to build the life he'd prevented me from having during our marriage. He'd given me truth about my origins, knowing it would connect me to family I'd been unknowingly close to for years. He'd structured everything so his death would free me rather than trap me in grief or financial struggle. Did this posthumous generosity excuse 15 years of emotional neglect and control? No. Did it explain why he'd built those walls between us? Yes, at least partially. Richard had been protecting me from his criminal entanglements while simultaneously trapping me in isolation. His final acts were attempts to make amends for years of distance, to give me tools for building a better future, to expose the corruption he'd been part of while shielding me from consequences. I forgave Richard eventually, not because he deserved forgiveness, but because carrying anger and resentment would have prevented me from fully enjoying the freedom he'd given me. I understood that he'd been a complicated man, deeply flawed, but ultimately trying to do right by me in the only ways he knew how. His love had been twisted by fear and secrets, but it had been real, and his final gift of wealth and truth was proof of that. 5 years have passed since Richard's death, and the revelations that followed. I'm 47 now, established in my career as a curator, close with my biological family while honoring my adoptive family who raised me, financially secure beyond anything I imagined in my 20s. I date occasionally but haven't remarried, enjoying independence and autonomy I never had during my marriage. I've used portions of Richard's inheritance to fund art programs for underprivileged youth, to support organizations helping adopted children connect with biological families, and to establish a foundation in Richard's name that supports financial literacy and legal services for women leaving controlling relationships. The twist wasn't just the money, though $48 million changed everything practically. The twist was discovering that the husband who'd seemed to care only about wealth had actually structured that entire fortune as a tool for my liberation. The twist was learning that the man who'd kept me at distance for years had been protecting me while gathering evidence to expose the criminal networks that had compromised his integrity. The twist was finding biological family through the most unexpected of connections. The twist was realizing that love and control and protection and harm can coexist in the same relationship, that people can be simultaneously selfish and selfless, that endings can be beginnings if you're willing to use them that way. Richard's final confession changed everything I understood about my marriage and my identity. It gave me wealth that allowed complete reinvention. It connected me to family I'd been searching for without knowing it. It freed me from financial dependence and emotional constraint. And it taught me that sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped in the most painful revelations, that truth matters even when it complicates everything, and that closure often arrives in forms we never expected. The fortune buried beneath $48 million wasn't more money. It was truth, connection, freedom, and possibility. It was Richard's final love letter, written in the language of lawyers and safes and sealed confessions rather than poetry, but no less powerful for that. It was the inheritance I needed more than I needed wealth, given by a man who understood me better than I'd believed he did, who loved me more than he'd been able to show while alive. And when I finally uncovered what Richard left buried beneath the fortune, nothing was ever the same. Not my life, not my understanding of love, not my sense of who I was and who I could become. The money was just the beginning. The truth was the real inheritance. And freedom was the gift that kept multiplying year after year as I built a life that was finally completely mine. If this story moved you, if you've ever discovered that endings were actually beginnings, smash that like button and subscribe. Share this with someone who needs to know that truth can set you free even when it hurts. Comment below about an inheritance that changed your life. Remember that wealth takes many forms, that the truth matters more than comfort, and that it's never too late to become who you were always meant to be.